You are most welcome to this video, and viewers with a long memory might remember we talked to Marc Jadot from Paris. So Marc, welcome and thank you for coming back.
Thanks for hosting me again. I'm really happy to be here.
Now we're examining your book, which we can see on the screen at the moment, The Needle's Secrets. And I wanted to get this on because the amount of work you've put into this book is really quite impressive. And especially considering you're writing in English. And thank you for doing this interview in English, by the way, because it's not your first language. So we appreciate that. But it really is quite an impressive piece of scholarship. Just give us an overall. People need to decide if they want to watch this interview or not. So what's this about?
This is about the biggest industrial accident in the history of the world, basically. It's basically a collective dystopia we didn't see, that we've been harming people for decades. And the way... it's now appearing because we've done the COVID vaccines, but vaccines and other intramuscular injections, like vitamins, for example, are often ill-injected or by pure hazard. A significant enough dose goes directly into the bloodstream at the moment of injection at a much higher concentration, and bypasses nature's protections, and triggers all the adverse events we've seen in the past 3 years. But also, in the book, I tie it back to most of the modern day, if not all of the modern day illnesses. So I tie it back to autism, which mothers have been saying for decades. I tie it back to neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. I tie it to infertility, the explosion of infertility in the Western world, as well as even leaky gut. And to a certain extent, I posit that there is that actually obesity is tied also to that. So it's actually a very significant piece. It's also an important document, an important book to reconcile families and to reconcile two experiences of vaccines. Because, of course, if you've had a vaccine and you're healthy, for you it's impossible to contemplate that there could have been, a probability that you would have been harmed or your children would have been harmed. You want to be safe. And on the other end, if you've been harmed by the vaccine, you know you've been harmed by the vaccine. And so I explained the possibility of having two very distinct opposing experiences with the vaccine in an extremely simple way.
Mm. And I think we can just demonstrate this in the most blatant form of what you're talking about. So we have that's probably a slightly larger needle than we would use normally. But when we stick that in, we don't know where it's going because we can't see it. Now, of course, we learn anatomical landmarks to put it in the heart of a muscle, deltoid muscle or vastus lateralis or gastrocnemius in the gluteal region. But if it goes into a blood vessel, then it's really quite simple that this is full of water. But if you aspirate back, then what you can see is the blood will go in.
Yeah.
And of course, tell us what that means, Marc.
Well, typically that would mean that you're inserted into a blood vessel. Yeah. But along the way, as you were, pushing that needle down in the muscle, it's going to push on cells. It's going to encounter small veins, venules, or small arterioles. And it's going to sometimes push them and often cut them. And that's, I think, I'm mea culpa as well. I think everybody got trapped into the way our brain works. And that is the fact that for anybody who's experienced an intravenous injection, it has to be done in a certain way, in a proper way, and it's extremely complicated for doctors and nurses to do that right. And therefore, the medical community has, for most likely 100 years, presumed that it was nearly impossible to hit a vessel when you're doing an intramuscular injection. But the problem is when you step back a minute and you say, well, is there another way? And the other way is fluid dynamics. Remember, a muscle, people don't realize that a muscle is actually fluid. It's cells and interstitial fluid. So when you're inserting your needle inside the muscle and you're cutting through those vessels, these vessels are open in a fluid. Okay, and we've known since Pascal and Bernoulli that if ever you push pressure on a liquid, it'll go where there's least pressure. And indeed, there's least pressure in those vessels, and therefore, it's not even. We don't even need to prove it. It's a scientific law. If it's within the distance of expansion of the vaccine injection or the dose, a bit of it will go. If it's very close, and if the vessel it's cut is actually large enough, a very big dose will go. Mm-hmm. If it's further away, the dose will diminish. A bit like if you're around a fire. If you're too close to the fire, you get too much energy, and as you're going away, you feel that there's still energy coming at you, but it's disseminated across, and at one point you can't feel the fire anymore. It's exactly the same thing that's happening. And after that, what does it mean? It means that you have a bolus, which is a term that you know very well, John, because in the medical establishment in hospitals, when you want to deliver a drug in a concentrated fashion to the brain to do, or to a contrast agent to the brain to do a brain scan, for example, or a drug to the heart or to the liver, you actually inject it with varying speeds a bolus, a high concentration dose of particles, drugs or others, so that they are delivered in a concentrated fashion. So we know that systematically, when you inject a vaccine, especially those COVID vaccines, you are going to deliver somewhere into the body a concentrated dose of that vaccine. And that's a big problem. That's a very big problem, because remember, John, I don't know if we had spoken about that last time, but these technologies emerge from anti-cancer vaccines, right? What do anti-cancer vaccines do? They're intended not to trigger antibodies, but to trigger T cells that are attacking tumors. So any one of these, the transfected cells, are the cells that would have uptaken a dose of vaccine, a particle of vaccines, will eventually get destroyed by the immune system. And if that's concentrated, okay, if that's concentrated, that's a real problem, because it's going to pose a challenge to the environment that is hitting. We've never evolved for large swaths of our linings, of the linings of our blood vessels, to be destroyed by our immune system, right? That's what we're seeing with white clot syndromes, for example, that you've been discussing recently. We've never evolved for that, and it triggers a number of imbalances, which align very much with all of the adverse events that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. And there's two things. Obviously, we want to aspirate, and incredibly, national guidelines tell nurses and doctors not to aspirate. It's just unbelievable. We should be aspirating all injections. And as you pointed out, Mark, it's how quick you inject it. So if you inject something really quite slowly, then you're going to get relatively low pressure. But if you inject it quickly, then you're going to get high pressure, and it's going to go everywhere. And if we inject it quickly, we're going to destroy these the walls of these delicate blood vessels, as you say, capillaries, arterioles, venules, very delicate walls. And that means that the fluid that we've injected that's in this interstitial space is going to go into the blood vessels. And you've actually calculated with Pfizer and Moderna, I believe, how big an area this depot, this bolus that's being given, will occupy in the muscle.
Yes, it's an expansion sphere in a way, from with the needle's tip at the center, and it's about 0.8 centimeters for Pfizer and about 1.1, if I recall, for Moderna, because they have a larger dose. There's 0.5 millimeter and 0.3 millimeter for Pfizer. So within that area, you're at risk. Now, what's important after that to understand is that there is also a preconceived idea that it's okay even if it's a small part of the dose, right? And remember, Pfizer, at least that's what they said originally, had said that their vaccine was 10 billion nanoparticles, and Moderna said 40 billion. Now, I had calculated that a coin-size aneurysm in the aorta is about 60,000 cells. Okay, so 60,000 nanoparticles hitting your aorta in a concentrated fashion during that first minute, okay, because what I'm talking about is this bolus has a very short window of opportunity between the moment it's inactive because it's coated and the moment it's disseminated and completely fragmented and diluted. There's a short window during which it can actually be very dangerous. And just so you understand, that little coin-sized aneurysm that will eventually, 4 or 5 months later, crack and open up, and you'll have dissection of your aorta and you will die. This is 0.0006% of the Pfizer vaccine. It's a tiny share of it. And therefore, and I'm not even talking about a stroke in the brain, or my best friend who had a leak, an arterial leak, had his leak almost killed him, and it was 1 millimeter wide, 1 square millimeter, and within 10 days he was dying because he was losing his blood. And that's 1 millimeter is 750 endothelial cells. It's nothing. Therefore, this is very important, and I think what we're going to have to contemplate is completely overhauling the delivery mechanisms of vaccines and potentially of other drugs that are causing similar problems.
And of course, this is the way I've been taught to give medicines all my life. I learned to do intramuscular injections when I was 18, and you put it in, you take care to aspirate while stabilizing the needle, and then you inject it relatively slowly. And yet, for some reason, the World Health Organization changed these guidelines. It's just bizarre that the World Health Organizations would change safe, tried and tested guidelines for what I consider to be unsafe practice.
It's obviously unsafe, that's certain. And it's the fact that we've added that, the fact that we've added so many new shots, okay? So by my calculation, because even with aspiration, for example, if you take the bodybuilders have a tremendous experience with that, and they have a feedback loop that's immediate. It's called trend cough. When the steroids they inject themselves gets to the lungs, they start coughing and because they collapse. So they have feedback. They know that even with aspiration and injecting slowly, there's a minimum of 2%. I believe that about 5% of injections are dangerous. And therefore, when you do the math, when you start, I have in the book, I don't know if you can show, but fundamentally, the more you vaccinate, the less chance of staying healthy you are. And there's a point to which the entire population, and notably the young, because they've been vaccinated much more than we have, John, much more. And so when you do the simulation, for example, in the book, I have a simulation of the entire US population. I did that really back of the envelope. But I end up with about 55 million people with clinical injuries and about 190 million people with injury harmed by the vaccines, right? And when you look at the ballpark figure, it's very consistent with the high level of disabled in the U.S. I think there's 64 million people who are disabled in the U.S. out of a population of 340 million. And one of my messages in the book at the end is to say, look, we need to wake up. We need to awaken. And my conclusion is people. We need to awaken to this, because if we continue with that, then everybody's going to be sick, and we're going to be in a civilization where you're going to have more people sick than actually healthy, and for something as trivial as a poorly designed or a flawed delivery protocol that's repeated billions of times. I've come from the automotive industry. In the automotive industry, you know that if you have a problem on your car and you repeat and you sell 100 million cars, it's going to come back to haunt you. This is much worse than that. It is literally the biggest industrial accidents and the biggest medical catastrophe in the history of the world.
But I mean, someone like me or any other competent health educator, I mean, I can train people how to do safe injections including the anatomical landmarks. Training student nurses would probably spend about a day on it, and then they could go and train everyone else. And yet the vast majority of the world is carrying out this procedure wrongly. It's just absolutely incredible. And I just want to give some evidence I know you've got a lot of evidence, Mark, but I've talked to, I've obviously given a lot of intravenous therapy in my life, and some drugs, for example, methylprednisolone, you give it, and the patients often get a metallic taste in the mouth, virtually straight away. Or I give some intravenous vitamins, and they can taste the vitamin B in their mouth within a few seconds.
Yeah.
And I've talked to quite a lot of people now who've had vaccine injury, definite clinically diagnosed vaccine injury, and several of those have confirmed to me that they got an odd taste in the mouth within seconds. Yes,
it's one of the points I make in the book. It's evidently, the bolus can go all sorts of places. It doesn't necessarily every time goes to the mouth. Okay.
Yeah.
But it does occasionally, and it is a very, very clear sign of accidental intravenous injection.
I think if it goes to your finger, you might not notice it, but the fact it's in your mouth and you have the sensation means you've got something to.
There are other signs, John. There's other signs of that. One study that many people have talked about, which is by Jonker et al. At Stanford. There was a small detail in there that showed that the T cell, the CD4s that were actually working, were expressing a marker called PDL1 or PD1, and that marker is a marker of exhaustion. And the vaccinated people who were healthy did not have that problem. What does that mean? It means that the immune cells had to destroy a significantly higher number of transfected cells. And that, again, can only happen with a bolus, which is much more effective at transfection.
Yeah. Of course, these CD4 cells are the T helper lymphocytes that stimulate the whole immune activity. Just tell us what you mean by transfection, please, Mark.
Okay, transfection is the fact of bringing an antigen or a foreign element inside a healthy cell, right? So you have infection is a virus. A virus penetrates a cell, he's going to infect it. And when you do that, when humans do that, or when pharma does that, or lab researchers do that, they force an antigen inside those cells. Now, one of the important points that I make in the book, and that's why I've been very alarmed, is the fact that many people have been saying, well, that's related only to mRNA. And that's not correct. The reality of it is that most vaccine technologies, apart from protein vaccines, and they also have issues, but in a much lesser extent, but attenuated vaccines, even inactivated virus vaccines, virus-like vaccines like HPV vaccines, for example, can actually do exactly the same thing. And in the book, I actually spent 2 or 3 weeks actually doing a deep dive in all the case reports of the past 50 years. And there's a table in which I show that every single vaccines is having the same types of adverse events, right? So remember, there are vaccines that have a different target, a different technology. So it's like you push here and you push here, but everything's come back here. Okay, something is not, it doesn't make sense. And that's because it's our immune system that's reacting exactly the same way for this target or this other target, and it's because there is this delivery problem.
I think you've just answered my next question, really, Mark. I was going to ask why you believe that the bolus theory is the main cause of adverse events. But I think you've done that because we're giving all sorts of different chemical preparations. And you know, rather than being the interaction of those individual chemicals and those drug preparations, it's the large amount of any foreign material, because there's very often common side effects from a range of different vaccines. Is that kind of your thinking?
Well, it's part of it. Yes, you're right, John. It's part of it. But it took me, to tell you the truth. I have been, looking at all the hypotheses, as anybody who does root cause analysis should do. So I have these whiteboards. I have 2 here. I have these huge whiteboards where I put all the hypotheses. I did the observation, and we can go to the observation later. I did a number of observations, and then I put all of the hypotheses and tested them. And I've been testing mine and some of my colleagues who have been stating facts, different theories. And for the past 2.5 years or 3 years, I've been saying, I don't understand. My theory looks like it's the only one that stands. And everybody was very annoyed by it. I understand that. And was saying, but it can't be. Right, which is not a scientific argument. It's so complex. Basically, it's so complex. It's going in so many places. It has so many different ways to materialize that it's not possible. And I, at the time, I didn't have an answer. I said, I don't know, but it sure looks like it because I can explain everything. And by the way, a large part of my theory, there's 2 parts to this theory. We can go to it later. But a big part of it is completely demonstrated and tested and reproducible on animals, etc. There's no discussion about that. And here's the reason why my theory is the only one that stands. It's not because I'm smart or anything. It's just fundamentally because there's only one way you can actually bypass nature. And it took me a little while to understand. Nature and evolution, whichever, or God, whichever, I'll let our audience choose.
We certainly have this wonderful body that we can't.
We have a wonderful body. We have a wonderful body which has been optimized by hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years of evolution, and we've been in an environment that's safe for less than 100 years. Yeah. Okay, let's remember, we ate poor nutriments. We ate in nature poison, etc. So we had to evolve. And I've written a few articles. I don't go into details of it in the book, but we have multiple layers of protections to mitigate, to filter, to manage poison. Okay, and we've known since Mithridates, that was 500 years before Christ, I think, something like that. We've known that we can intake poison in small dose, right? So why is that? Because first of all, when we ingest something or when we breathe something, we don't take a whole dose like a bolus, okay? It goes in progressively, it's spread out across the intestines, it's spread out across the lungs or the mouth. It's when it penetrates the bloodstream, people don't realize that most of the bloodstream is actually storage. The lumen, which is the inside of the blood vessel, is not touching anything. It's not touching the tissue. It's not touching the sides. At any given time, 99% of the blood is not in contact with. So it's a mitigation strategy in so that 99% of the blood goes to the liver, the spleen, the kidneys for filtration. And if ever there's too much poison, then it can't all be filtered, then it actually gets disseminated across the body. It's going to do a little harm here, a little harm there, but it's impossible that it's going to do much harm, because each ecosystem locally will be able to deal. So you'll kill, let's say you have a bit of poison, just a molecule of poison that can kill one cell. It's going to kill that cell. The ecosystem behind is going to replace that cell, and then the outcome of that cell that's been destroyed with the poison is going to be taken care of by the immune system. It's a sort of a bulletproof vest effect, if you will.
When you cut yourself, it's going to the infection is going to drain into the lymphatics, and you've got that whole lymphatic layer of protection as well. But
exactly. I mean, there's multiple layers of protection. What the accidental IV does is bypass it.
Yeah, that needle can bypass all of those natural.
During at least during the first 30 to 50 seconds.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's going to go through your heart in a high concentrated way. It's going to go through your lungs in a high concentrated way. It's going to go to your organs, to your capillaries in a concentrated way. And, then after that, it's luck. It's how big the bolus is, where it hits. In some cases, it's going to destroy part of the organ, and the organ is going to be able to reconstitute because of stem cells and regenerate. But in many cases, that's not possibility, either because the damage is too big or because there's little stem cells in those areas, like the heart, like the brain. So that's fundamentally the reason why the bolus theory is likely the only one, because there isn't so many ways you can bypass the body. After that, there are different ways you can harm. Okay, and we can go through that if you're interested. There's different mechanisms. One big chunk of the theory is disbalance in the cardiovascular system. Basically, the damage is so big and so widespread that you no longer have the body doesn't know where to throw the healing, right? So you're going to have too much demand for coagulation, and you're going to have thrombosis, or you're going to have a stroke, or you're going to have too much demand for growth, or for example, blood vessel creation, and you're going to have fistulas and angiomas because you have too much of that demand going to just one place, being monopolized to a certain extent. Or some of the repair is going to be monopolized somewhere else, and some areas are not going to be repaired, and you're going to have calcification, and you're going to have arteriosclerosis, for example. Arteriosclerosis is certainly not cholesterol. Okay, arteriosclerosis, when you read the data and you do the tie, and I have a whole chapter on that in the book, is really the fact that you've damaged the endothelium in a significant portion. The fibrin has been dissolved, because it's supposed to be dissolved after a certain point of time by the plasmin that's generated by the plasmin activators that's generated by the endothelium. And basically, then you have calcification that occurs, and you're not supposed to have calcium, and therefore it's going to become a trap. It's going to trap cholesterol, it's going to trap metabolic waste, it's going to trap all sorts of things, that explains why more than 50% of Americans, adult Americans, actually have arteriosclerosis. Arteriosclerosis is something very difficult to do because you need to damage in a very, very large area of the linings, and that doesn't happen naturally.
It's basically an inflammatory process, isn't it? Whatever.
Yes, there is another big part of my discovery. One big discovery is microperforation of the vascular system. I don't know if it's my discovery, but actually I conceptualized it as a problem. If you see, you know that what you can be certain of, in science, you can have uncertainties, but you need to have some pillars. One thing you know is that this bolus is going to basically be fragmented and be filtered and be disseminated across. So a big part of, and the body does that marvelously well with oxygen and everything. That's how we stay alive. If you do, that means that a lot of the bolus is going to be hit in a fragmented way. It's going to hit like little clusters. And clearly there is, again in the book I demonstrate that there's a whole literature that talks about vascular leakage or capillary permeability. Actually, myocarditis and pericarditis is nothing else. It is holes in the capillaries, in the blood-heart barrier, okay, or in the blood myocyte barrier, whatever it's called. It's holes there, and therefore it lets in elements that are inflammatory. Okay, now you take this problem in myocarditis, and if these holes remain over time, then you're going to have constantly inflammation, and at one point that can become degenerative. Okay, that's what's happening in the blood-brain barrier with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. It's also where you don't necessarily feel it because the brain doesn't have pain, but it's exactly the same process for all the neurodegenerative disease. Neuropathies is exactly that. If you have a nerve, and in the capillaries of the nerves you have microperforations, you're going to have metabolic waste, you're going to have elements that are not supposed to get in, and you're going to have immune cells that are going to be active and create inflammation, and you're going to have a lot of pain and a lot of inflammation. And that's, by the way, that's the reason why people who fast manage very quickly to get down that inflammation. Why? Because there's less junk, or there's less metabolic waste in the blood, and the immune system is going to have less elements, less metabolic waste to take out of those areas that are not supposed to be.
And less components to stimulate inflammatory processes.
Exactly. Endometriosis is exactly the same thing. What is endometriosis? It's you have cells that behave like cells in the uterus, but they're not necessarily in the uterus. And why is that? Well, because the estrogens that they're getting premenstrual cycles is stimulating them when it shouldn't, and therefore when you stop it, they behave like and it's extremely painful. So you see this, and you can push the same problem of microperforation to the testis, the male testis, where when that occurs, and we saw from Professor Burkhardt that it happens, right? It goes to the testis. Well, the sperm, the male sperm, is not supposed to be in contact with your immune system. If it is expressing elements that we don't typically express, and therefore the immune system is going to kill them. And that explains also why you would have sperm count that dropped. There was this study that was done in Israel post-vaccination where we saw a drop in, I think, 40% of the sperm count, and that explains it very well. And I could go on. I mean, I think leaky gut is exactly that. It's microperforation of the gut-blood barrier. You have elements that are not yet digested, like gluten, for example, that we're not supposed to be in contact with the blood, that are inflammatory, and therefore you have an inflammation, and it explains all the bowel inflammatory disorders.
Did you
right?
just unpick a little bit, Mark, how this micro perforation is caused?
The endothelium in across the body plays a fundamental role in the organs, and in the systems also. It's also true in the nervous system. So it plays a role of blood tissue barrier.
Right.
Okay. So in the capillaries. So it basically is just a one layer. It's just a tiny layer. In the capillary, that's all there's left. Okay. If you destroy it and you don't repair it, you've gotten rid of basically the function of filtering what's coming in and filtering what's coming out. So for example, if you hit an endocrine gland, the adrenal gland, for example.
So if bolus of this material happens to be going through the endocrine gland, causes transfection, that leads to inflammatory destruction of some of the vascular endothelium.
Yes, the T cells will destroy all the cells that have been infected or transfected, and it'll leave a hole. That's a physical hole. Okay, it's a physical hole. It's gone. So anything that was filtering, notably hormones, will leak out. Okay, so for example, microperforation explains, and I have a whole table, all the endocrine disorders where you have hypersecretion. Because there's no, and I have this, I was telling you when we discussed earlier this morning, when you called me, about the case of two young men, or young boys who were 14 and 16, who died in 2022, I think, or 2022, 3 days and 4 days after their vaccination. And the autopsy showed that their hearts had contraction bands. So basically the heart had contracted so much that they had died. And they didn't have myocarditis. They didn't have any T cell attacks to the heart. And when I looked, in the literature, what could cause that, I found that a high dose of epinephrine would do that.
Or adrenaline, it's the same.
Or adrenaline, yeah. In the US, it's epinephrine. In Europe, it's adrenaline. Yeah. But fundamentally, so you can imagine, you have the adrenal gland, you have adrenaline stored, right? Yep. And constantly there, our bodies deal with adrenaline. Now you open up those gates, and you've got, I don't remember the quantity, but the quantity was like the equivalent of a high dose. And that went to the heart directly and killed those kids. I'm making an informed, let's say an informed hypothesis, but it makes a lot of sense. There's a study that showed clearly microperforation of the heart. It was a Japanese study. There is also a study actually by Nakahara, a Japanese study, that shows that every single heart, everyone, has been microperforated to a degree or another. Everybody, which also basically builds my theory that everybody gets hit. That was also the case with a study by Bergin and all with Professor Müller in Basel University Hospital. They showed that too. So this is really what's happening. And what's interesting about it is once you know what happens, once you understand that, you can start thinking of ways to cure that, right? And I was telling you about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which is authorized by the FDA, notably to repair after, to revascularize after cancer treatments, after radiotherapies, but it also is used for people who become deaf or blind. So it's not something that I made up. There is considerable literature that shows that it actually repairs the endothelium, because it's actually triggering it's called hyperoxia, the excess of oxygen triggers stem cells to replicate, and the stem cells go on and repair. They are repairmen. They spend their days repairing our bodies. And I want to say one of the beautiful things that happened, or stories that I read in those 4 years of reading pretty sad stuff, is the story of microchimerism. I don't know if you know about that. The fact that fetuses repair their mom, pregnant mom, with their stem cells that circulate. So it's proven that women who've had children have less Alzheimer's and Parkinson, which literally means that stem cells can repair the endothelium, because Alzheimer's, Parkinson, Huntington, all these neurodegenerative diseases are proven to be related to this microperforation of the blood-brain barrier. That's now accepted by the scientific community.
And it's a beautiful idea that the baby's stem cells, the fetal stem cells, would synergize with the mother and result and cause healing in the mother. It's and
it's not an idea; it's a fact. Yeah, there are researchers that found they found Y chromosomes in the mother's brains. So indeed, it could have been an X. I'm not saying that only boys repair their mothers. But that's all I'm saying. It was just much more simple to test.
Yeah, you wouldn't notice the Y chromosome in my brain. There's probably quite a few there already. And in most men's brains, I hazard to guess. Exactly. Judging from their behaviour. Now, I think the bolus theory also explains why some people seem to have harm and some people don't have to have harm after the COVID vaccines. This harmed, not harmed dichotomy. Do you think that explains that?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You have people who get a bigger dose or a large, and they get harmed in such a way that the body cannot heal, or it takes time to heal, and that's the dichotomy. Everybody gets hit. Okay, let's be clear. As I said, Nakahara has shown that. There's several studies that are showing that everybody's getting a little bolus.
Yep.
Okay. Which makes sense.
I'm not getting any more mRNA vaccines, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm not getting either. But what's clear is there are some people who get a dose, of course, for which the body, we have never evolved for that kind of damage.
Yeah, of course.
Now there is another way you can damage. Okay, so that's basically the cardiovascular system. One other protection that our bodies have is a genetic bunker. I call it the genetic bunker. It's basically protecting our stem cells. Why do you need to protect our stem cells? Well, because if our stem cells are there to repair, regeneration, to create red blood cells, billions of them every day, and to create white blood cells, which are immune cells, which are both also extremely important to life, billions of them every day. So if you do not want to harm those, and you don't want to insert anything in those, Because we know from normal cells that the only way the body has to get rid of a poison or to get rid of a virus is to commit suicide, right? If evolution had found a way, we would not do that. It's an extremely resource intensive way to do that. So that means that stem cells haven't the solution either. If they had, they would have passed it on by evolution. Every single cell in our body has evolved from a stem cell.
Well, they pass it on by simple mitosis.
Exactly. It would have been. So that means that stem cells should never be contaminated. And that explains where they're located and the way they fuel themselves. They are located in the bone marrow. So it's not very easily accessible to bacteria, to parasites, or anything.
It's like you say, it's a physiological bunker where they can hide away and.
Exactly, it's a physiological bunker. It's also disseminated. It's distributed, so you have several areas. So it's extremely well protected, and it's also in endothelial niches. So in the endothelial, it's hidden away behind, and it because of that, it cannot feed on oxygen. It needs to feed on sugar, the famous glycolysis. And the only way where that could occur again is either being very unlucky with a vaccine. Okay, for a vaccine particle that is properly injected, that go through the lymphatic system, the lymphatic node that gets distributed to the inside back to the bloodstream, it's going to be
incredibly unlikely.
Very unlikely, and because we've evolved for that, because it needs to be extremely unlikely that a virus that's contained in us actually reaches them. Otherwise, we'd have problems. So, but the bolus changes that again. Because indeed, it's unlikely that if there's one little stem cells on this wall, if I throw a dart that I will get it, I'll have one chance in a million of hitting it. But if I throw thousands or millions of them of darts, I will have a bigger chance of hitting it. And that's what we're seeing. And that means that we have a problem, because when that occurs, and we know that it happens quite often, okay, probably, again, 1 shot out of 20, in my estimate, is actually getting a significant amount. Then what can that stem cell do, and why is it a problem? Well, that stem cell can do only one thing, and that's divide. It's divide to basically avoid the poison and protect a part of the genetic code, right? So what it's going to do, and we know that is a strategy. I call it the evasion by replication strategy. So you put poison into that, whatever, contaminant. It can be the mRNA vaccine, it could be another vaccine, it could be maybe a vitamin, or it could be a toxin or a virus. The stem cell is going to very rapidly divide so that at one point it keeps one that's intact and safe.
It'll divide into two. One will remain a stem cell and the other will go on to divide into a population of cells.
Yeah, but it's going to continue dividing. Even that one will most likely still have enough poison in it that it still needs to replicate.
I see.
Right. So if you need to divide 100 times to get to the first level, you see how many divisions you're going to need. Mm-hmm. What happens, there are two things that happen, the consequence of that I explain in the book. The first point that occurs is then you have an infrastructure of stem cell that is in excess. It's not like we don't have a number of counts that's precise. Why? Because it's not like the way they communicate, they don't send a list we don't send a list of what's needed. It's because you have an architecture that is extremely well proportioned, that whenever there's demand for repair, or blood or red blood cells or white blood cells, you get a certain amount. Now, if ever you start having, my analogy is always the same now. It's if you have 10 or 100 cooks in the kitchen, and you ask for your burger, you end up with 100 burgers,
Yeah.
right? That's what you do. That's what you get. You end up with 100 burgers, which is a definition of cancer, right? It's the very definition of cancer. You're creating. So if it's in the bloodstream, if it's a blood cancer, you're going to have leukemia, okay, which is a definition. You have too many lymphocytes, okay. If it's a solid tumor in an organ, you're going to have a tumor, which is a definition of an excess of unwanted cells in a place where it's not supposed to be.
Yep.
Now, let me tell you two elements that are very important to convince your audience that I'm pretty sure that's what's happening, even though it's a conjecture, I admit it, okay? The first point is that for the past 20 years, there's been considerable research that has been stating that cancer cell of origin, so basically the original cancer cells, are stem cells. Okay, I didn't invent that. I said it can only be this way. But then when I started looking into it, I found a whole literature of people who have been saying, look, it has to be a stem cell that starts a cancer. I guess nobody was, how should I say, crazy enough to say that it could be vaccines, because it was probably a bad career move for a researcher. that's why it has to be an MBA that finds this, presumably. But there is considerable literature across the world. I quote it in the book that shows that says, and the reason for that is because when you look at the features of a cancer cell, for example, something that people have been talking about a lot, which is p53 inhibition, a gene that stops apoptosis. Well,
so this is called a non-co-suppressor gene. It stops cancers.
Well, yes, but it's also because it's p53 is the gene that permits apoptosis, which is suicide, self-suicide. Right. So if you're a cell that can't commit suicide,
yeah, and something goes wrong,
you have a problem.
But all you can do is divide and reproduce. Yeah.
Yeah, because stem cells are so precious, they can't commit suicide, and they have p53 inhibition. They not only have they p53 inhibition, but they don't have MHCs because they need to be immune privileged, because you don't want the immune system to attack them.
So this major histocompatibility complex is what allows the immune system to recognize the difference between the self and the non-self cells. Exactly,
except stem cells and progenitor cells either don't have it because they're too precious, especially the senior ones, or when they get specialized, they get immune suppression, okay, so that the immune system doesn't target them. And so there is the expression of a gene called HTERT, which repairs the telomeres. Of course, if you're a stem cell, you're replicating all the time. And you need your telomeres to be repaired constantly.
So that the telomeres are the end parts of the chromosomes, and when the telomeres get smaller, that's associated with aging.
Exactly. So stem cells cannot afford to age. So there, in the book, I list a number of features that are stem cell specific, and that supposedly the traditional cancer theory says that normal cells have regained all of these features. And that, to be honest with you, I had never questioned that myself. But when you think about it, from a mathematical standpoint, from a probability standpoint, it's impossible. It's impossible that systematically they would always mutate back to stem cells. There's each time you're talking millions, one chance in a million of it happening, and you have like 15 or 20 different elements that are specific.
Well, they're mutating back to immortal cells, aren't they? They'll go on dividing forever and ever.
Well, that's what the traditional theory says. But what the reality of it is, my theory, or my hypothesis now, is that that's not what's happening. What's happening is what evolution is trying to avoid by hiding it away, is contamination of stem cells, and therefore damaging on the one hand, creating too many stem cells, and the other aspect, which is also, then you'll see it's very clear, what happens during cell division, which mitosis you were talking about. What happens is that there's no nucleus. So the in a way, when I say stem cells are bunker, they're hidden away, and then the genetic material is hidden away also inside the cells. It's protected by a nucleus inside the cell. But during mitosis, this is gone.
The wall of the nucleus goes and the chromosomes are there.
Exactly, the chromosomes split off.
Yeah.
Now imagine, you don't, again, I don't need to prove any of this because it has to happen. If you have a contaminant at the moment of that, it's going to tinker, and it's going to interact with both the process, so the separation process, possibly breaking it, miscalibrating it, so you'll have two chromosomes staying in one area, no chromosome going on the other, depending on which side it's at. You're going to have a Down syndrome or other monosomy and trisomy elements. If you have material that is actually DNA, which we know from my friend Kevin McKernan's work, that DNA can integrate or actually into the new nucleus, right? It can actually integrate with the chromosomes or simply in the nucleus by just being present, and therefore you've changed the DNA of one human being. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be significant, but you can actually do that, and you can actually also damage the DNA. So in the Bolus theory framework, I think you were showing earlier, all the three ways that you can harm genetically human beings happen in that area and in that area alone, in stem cells. A lot of people have been talking about integrating into the genome of humanity. I'm not that panicked on that because some people will have that, they are at risk, but it needs to be the germline, it needs to be evidently a male, in age or of procreation or wanting to procreate, etc. And if not all of the boluses are going to go to the testes. Sometimes they're going to do considerable damage, and the stem cells will be destroyed. So the window is going to be small. I don't think the human genome is going to be irreparably harmed by that, to put a little calm on that. But clearly, it explains many genetic disorders. Now, I shared with you my experience, my test. I tested the Bolus theory on autism. When I started writing this, I started by building a structure, and that was a painful intellectual process, as you can imagine. And so one afternoon I said, okay, let's stop the structure. It's just my brain is blown away. I need to rest, and I'm going to do something. I'm going to test my theory on something that I know nothing about, which is autism. I mean, you can see there's a brain there. I'm fascinated by the brain. But I had always left autism aside because it's too much of it's a complex system in movement, in development. I don't think, I don't like working on things that there's too many rabbit holes. But I did say, look, I said, if all these mothers are correct, that state that they had a child that was healthy, that got vaccinated and had autism after, then it has to be the bolus. And I'm right, it has to be the bolus. Then I can state a few facts, hypotheses that need to be true for my theory to be right. Why? Because you know that a person who had a bolus and had a bolus hit an amygdala and damage it, there's a huge proportion that this bolus is going to hit elsewhere. It's a chaotic process. So it's going to hit another areas of the brain. It's going to hit the arterial system. It's going to hit the heart. It's going to hit all. So basically, I had already listed all of the framework that you saw, and I said, okay, well then, if you are autistic, there's a fair chance you're going to have more Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, that you would have had an early stroke as a child, that you will have hearing impairments, that you will be more often blind or would have more visual problems than the general public, that you will have endocrine disorders, all of them, and in some cases you're going to have secretion, you're going to be releasing too much hormone. In some cases you're going to have destroyed the gland, so you're going to have hyposecretion of hormones. You're going to hit the heart and you have congenital heart disease. You're going to hit the intestines. You're going to have leaky gut.
Yeah, and of course, these wouldn't all be in one people, but the point is if you have got one bolus, it's likely to damage more than one tissue.
Exactly. So at a population level, if you compare the population level of autistic and healthy people, they should have more of these medical conditions, including cancer, including obesity, including genetic disorders. I listed 40 of them in that afternoon, and I went on to look for odds ratio. And they all came out positive. 40 hypotheses. Just imagine...
So when autism is likely, one of these other conditions is also more likely to be present than in a non-autistic person.
Yes. In the book, you can go... Here's part of the list. And you see they have very, allergies, 4.5 odd ratio. Alzheimer's, 2.6.
So that's 4.5 times more likely to have allergies.
Yeah. Blindness, 1.5. Bone joint muscle problems, 7.5. Cancer, 1.9. Celiac disease, 1.87. Crohn's disease, 1.37. Endocrine disorder, 2.92.
That's like nearly 3 times more likely. These are huge. Is this known in the medical literature? Is this known, Mark? It just seems incredible.
It's known that they have that, but nobody. I'm the first person to explain why it's happening.
The fundamental underlying cause.
Yes. Everybody thought it was genetic, etc. Nobody, And what's interesting, to be honest with you, John, what's interesting, it's not limited to autism. When you start looking at people who have cancer, and you find that they often have arteriosclerosis, they have leaky gut, they get fat, etc. When you have all of these other they coincide. So it's going back to what I was telling you, for me to be wrong and for this theory to be wrong, after 40 hypotheses, that's one chance out of 1 trillion. Right? It's like, me not knowing a nuclear plant and saying, let me tell you 40 things in a row that have to be true to build a decent nuclear plant without me knowing anything about nuclear energy. It's impossible. It's impossible.
That's based on hard data. This is not armchair science, is it? This is going out, getting the data, testing it empirically, and finding out it's a consistent modality of explanation.
I had a conversation 6 months ago with a British Nobel Prize winner. We spent 90 minutes together, and I explained him my theory, and I told him about this 40 hypotheses. His answer was, "Wow."
Well, that's my answer. and I'm not even a Nobel Prize winner, to put it well.
No, but it's mathematically impossible that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
That's what it says. This is what it says. It's very important. It's that's why I dedicated 3 years of my life to this.
Oh, I know. What you've done is stunningly impressive.
Because there's no way this is not happening.
Whatever you do, even if you're not interested in Mark's book, he deserves people to buy this book. So go and buy it.
Yeah, I'm broke.
And,
Yeah,
we'll put the links
paying
up.
the price.
But if you've got any interest in this at all, you will find it a fascinating and very well researched, very well researched read. Where do we need to go, Mark? I mean, how on earth do we get authorities to start realising what is going on here and telling people to give injections properly?
Well, we're going to have to. First of all, my book needs to come out and take precedence, because there are numerous people who are saying. You see, one of the problems we've had in speaking out. Of course, there's been censorship, but there's also been theories that don't make sense. Okay, so if you have a theory that doesn't make sense and you're on the south, the side that's doubting, that's very confident that the vaccines are safe, you very quickly can see that it's not reproducible. For example, if you take circulating spike theory, which people have been talking about, every single vaccinated person is going to have circulating spike in large number. Okay, therefore, if they're healthy, it means that their theory is not reproducible. It's been tested on millions of people, and billions of people, and billions of people are okay. And that's basically
Thankfully.
Yes, yes, we should be. Yes, of course. It happened to my son. I can tell you when I got the D-dimer reports from him 2 years ago, I was very happy he was okay. But we need to acknowledge the camp that has been whistleblower camp, and I was part of that, and I've been part of that for 4 years now, have to base themselves on facts and reality. The reality is that antibodies do their work and they bind to spike. So after a few days, spike is gone. If ever,
in most people.
Yes, but even if some people have, even if what I just said about genetic disorder, integrating the DNA into a few stem cells, it's never going to be the problem, because our bodies know how to deal with amyloids or with foreign proteins that we're not supposed to have. We have antibodies for that, and they do their work. I'm not concerned. Actually, I know a lot of people are afraid of the IgG4, for example. IgG4, a lot of people don't realize that there are no antibodies. There's no spike being produced after jab 2, or hardly any, and therefore it's natural that the immune system would start producing IgG4 to reduce the antibodies, because you would have antibodies wandering around for nothing. Okay, that also is proven. So the problem is as a community, we haven't been communicating well. Both sides, it's been very difficult, or even inside our team. Now it's time to. I think most of the theories are not sustainable. I know mine is extremely robust. It hasn't budged in 3 years. The more I advance, the more it's robust. It actually scales. So now I don't say it's only limited to vaccines. You can have vitamin problems. You have people. This taste in the mouth you were talking about happens. I have a friend who's an anesthetic in Florida. He tells me it happens to his patients all the time. And there are consequences when the bolus saturates some areas that can be dangerous. So where do we go from there? Well, first of all, my book needs to be a success, and people need to understand it. They need to learn it, and they need to be able to talk to their neighbors about it. It's extremely important. It's important to. We need to do two things. We need to do three things, and both all of them are related to hope, John. The first one is to stop saying that everybody's going to die, because it's not true. Not everybody's been harmed. Thank God our bodies are wonderful, and they take care of us.
Despite this ludicrous, reckless experiment.
Despite the craziness.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's been doing that for 50 years. So that's the first point. People shouldn't be too scared.
Yeah.
That's the first. The second point is we need to reinvent injection. If you believe in vaccines, I think we've gone too far. I think we could cut down many of the vaccines, yes. HPV, many chickenpox, plenty of vaccines we didn't have when we were children. I don't think our children need them, but we need to overall at least a delivery.
The vaccines that we do give should be evidence based, and we've just kept adding one. That's even a different thing. My position here is I think it's going to be very difficult to fight vaccines, because it's ingrained into the mind of many people. If people want to vaccinate themselves or their children, my position is it's your right, but I don't want you to harm your children. And let's use correct injection technique. It's remarkably simple.
So we need to. I think we need to overhaul entirely the intramuscular injection. Maybe it's through patches. Maybe it's through whatever is. I don't want to jump into that role. It's not my role. But we need to overhaul it. And the last point is an extremely important point, and I think the medical community is going to have to, and doctors especially, will need to make amends. And one way for them to make amends is to help cure people. Yeah. And the way I think oxygen therapy is certainly a way. It doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve fibrin, for example. Nattokinase is probably helpful for that. But for all the disease related to microperforation, for many of the disease where you are harmed, where you have had necrosis, if it works for necrosis after radiation, it most likely works for necrosis after an ischemia. I think we don't have enough in the world today. We don't have enough hyperbaric chambers, certainly not. But we can go with oxygen therapy, normal baric and normal oxygen, and stimulate stem cell that way. So there's a huge hope for the world to repair billions of people who have been harmed, and notably our children, our grandchildren, and maybe your grandchildren. I don't have grandchildren yet.
I've got 3.
Yes, I can imagine that. I could actually I had two or three of my boys could be dads, but
I had to encourage mine a little bit, maybe.
But they've been harmed. I mean, I think the generation that is today 25 and under, or 30 and under, have been harmed considerably because they've had sometimes 80 shots in their lives. And when you look at the probability of being hit by a bolus, and a severe one, it's almost 100. I mean, a bolus, it's almost 100%. So it's 100%. Yeah. So we need the collectiveness, the collectivity, our community, to open up their eyes, right? To look at the fact. I mean, that's why, as a non-biologist and a non-doctor, I took a hat of an engineer.
You most certainly are a biologist now, Mark. That's for sure.
I don't know, but I've worked as an engineer. My dad, I come from a family of engineers. I have a DNA of an engineer. What I have done is I've structured everything like an engineer would do, and I was trained as a consultant always to prove what I say. So most of the time when I tell you something, I have 3 or 4 different ways to cross-prove it, because I know I'm going to take a lot of flack, and therefore it makes my book extremely documented.
Yep.
I think I have
it's very well referenced.
450, maybe 500 scientific references. It's extremely logical. There's no I explain why things are happening and why they make sense from an evolutionary standpoint, for example. And so going forward, people need to learn about the Bolus theory. They need to understand what it means for them, for their future, for their cure. And we need to start talking to, making this public, like we are doing today. And word of mouth needs to work so that it gets to the authorities and they get their act together.
Yeah, and it's low-hanging fruit. Yeah, we need to. Yeah, absolutely.
There's no other way.
Yeah.
But Mark, it's a message of hope, huh?
Yeah,
it's a message of hope.
It is. That's great. Whatever you do, buy Mark's book. You won't be disappointed.
Yes, please do.
I've encouraged you to go on for an hour and 15 minutes now, Mark, so I think that's probably enough. I'd like to do one more thing. On YouTube, you have something called YouTube Shorts. So you can put up 1-minute messages. Would you like to give the concise message of what we've talked about in French for our francophone listeners?
We can try.
Yeah, go for that.
Alors, John m'a reçu depuis un peu plus d'une heure et j'ai parlé de ma théorie du bolus, qui est grosso modo le fruit de 10 000 heures de travail et qui s'explique sur un bouquin que j'ai écrit en anglais. La teneur de ce travail, c'est de dire que les vaccins et les injections intramusculaires, depuis 50 ans, sont systématiquement mal injectées. C'est-à-dire qu'elles vont pour partie dans le sang directement et causent l'ensemble des maladies modernes, l'autisme, Alzheimer, Parkinson, les maladies endocriniennes, etc. Voilà ce dont j'ai parlé avec John, qui me recevait pour la deuxième fois amicalement.
I was nodding because I was pretending I understood part of that. I did pick up a few things. Must be fantastic being bilingual, Mark. Quite amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I could try to do it in Spanish, but my Spanish is a bit rusty.
We'll put that up as a short because people in Canada and France and the French-speaking world will appreciate that, I'm sure. Mark, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll put all the links, of course, and let's talk again. I think you've got a coherent theory that people really need to listen to. At the very least, it's a hypothesis that demands peer review. It's
actually, I wanted to propose you that we jointly together we should review some case reports, because with that framework, it makes it so it's extremely clear what happened to these people. Sometimes you're wondering, how can that occur? But with the framework with the theory that I have, it's all very, very eye-opening in a way. It's
and we need people that are familiar with cases around the world to view it through the lens of the Bolus theory as well and see.
Exactly.
See that tells us about individuals.
Exactly.
For now, Mark, thank you very much, and we'll talk again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting me again, John.
It's a pleasure.